It was the day that the House voted to pass the Affordable Care Act. And there was a sense of inner joy with President Obama that night that you didn't see that much. And at one point, he said to me that he was happier on that day than he was the day that he was elected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because you do all this in the hopes that you get to a point where you can get some stuff done that really helps, the American people.
That was our guest, legendary photographer Pete Souza. And I'm Mark Updegrove, President and CEO of the LBJ Foundation.
And I'm Mark Lawrence, Director of the LBJ Presidential Library. And this is With the Bark Off. Pete Souza is one of the nation's leading photojournalists, and few have risen to greater prominence. He worked as an official White House photographer for Ronald Reagan and the chief official White House photographer for Barack Obama. Among many other distinctions, he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001, along with colleagues at the Chicago Tribune, for explanatory journalism on the airline industry. And last year, he was inducted into the International Photography Hall of Fame.
His books include Obama, An Intimate Portrait, one of the best-selling photography books of all time, Shade, A Tale of Two Presidents, and his latest, The West Wing and Beyond, What I Saw Inside the Presidency. Mark and I talked to Pete about his unique vantage point on the presidency and the presidents he has worked with and captured for history.
Pete Souza, thank you so much for joining us on With the Bark Off. Wonderful to have you. Your role in American life in the last 40 years is so unique. White House photographer, right? It's a very small number of people who can claim to have held this position. How does one get to be a White House photographer?
Luck. I think luck and circumstance. And, just being in the right position when that door opens open for you for some reason. I think everybody goes about it a different way. I don't know that there's any, you can't write 3 bullet points. Here's how you become the next chief official White House photographer, because I think each of us that have had that role have gotten there in a different way. And I think in every situation there's a component of luck involved. I always joke that the odds are better to buy a lottery ticket than to...
Yeah. How about in your case? What were the lucky breaks along the way?
In my case, the first time around, when I was still in my 20s, I had connected with this photo editor at the Kansas City Star when I was working for small newspapers in Kansas, about working for her at the Kansas City Star. And she didn't hire me, which I was, upset about, but she hired somebody with more experience. Unbeknownst to me, she kept track of my career. And a few years later, after she had become the White House photo editor, she reached out to me when they had an opening on the staff. And so it was a professional connection. The second time involved, just circumstance and luck, in that I had taken a job with the Chicago Tribune as their national photographer based in D.C. I was doing stories all over the country, matter of fact, all over the world. I'd gone to 2 war zones. And then in 2004, this guy named Barack Obama was elected to the Senate. And a correspondent and I embarked on this project documenting his first couple years in the Senate. And I was getting access that no other photographer was getting. So I was in his, personal space a lot. He got to know me a little bit professionally and saw how I worked. And skip ahead till the 2008 election, just before couple weeks before the inauguration, he asked me to become his chief official White House photographer.
And that was lightning striking twice for you because you had served as an official White House photographer in the Reagan White House. But before we talk about those two stints and kind of break them down, Pete, let's talk about just the role of White House photographer for a moment. In so many ways, as a White House photographer, you have a better vantage point on the presidency than anyone else but the president himself. You're there for almost all the moments, at least the public moments, that a president has in that role. What might most surprise us about the day-to-day job of being president of the United States?
I think that most presidents are at work constantly. There's really no time off. And when there is time off, when you do go on vacation, you're still the president, and there's still decisions that you have to make while you're on vacation. And I think that, there were some days when President Obama would have, especially those first couple of years, the most stressful meetings on the economy. We were in the middle of this recession, and then go right from one of those meetings to the Situation Room to talk about Afghanistan, and then come back up to the Roosevelt Room and have this stressful meeting about healthcare. There's just like so many things that come to his plate, if you will, every day. It's nonstop. And I think you don't even realize that until you're actually in the job. It's a hard thing to, we have all these people that are going to be campaigning likely for the presidency in 2024, right? And, campaigning is not the same as being the president. I just saw President Obama the other day. He campaigned for Mandela Barnes and Tony Evers here in Wisconsin, and he was fired up at his talk. But that's the campaigning side of him. So it's almost like, as president, you have these two personalities. When you're out there publicly on the podium and you're trying to sell the healthcare bill, or you're trying to campaign for candidates, you're kind of fired up. But then when you're in the office every day, it's not like that. It's there's thinking involved. You have people presenting you with options on these really difficult decisions. There's back and forth. It's much more laid back, I think, if you will, and obviously much more stressful in the job.
And Pete, you just published a fascinating new book, The West Wing and Beyond, What I Saw Inside the Presidency. And I think the goal of this book is to go beyond those grand moments when, presidents stand in front of enormous numbers of people and sort of look at the day-to-day. Talk a little bit about your day-to-day as White House photographer. What did you do all day?
Yeah, I think there was sort of a routine, but every day was also a little bit different because you never knew what to expect. So essentially, I'd get to the White House early morning, usually at least an hour before the president came down from the residence to the West Wing. Just try to get caught up on any emails, or I was also the director of the photo office, so I have some internal decisions I have to make, and then go upstairs. My office was on the ground floor of the West Wing, less than 100 steps from the Oval Office, run up the stairs and hang out in the outer Oval until the outer Oval Office, which is adjacent to the Oval Office, until the president came over from the residence. And then basically I'd just shadow him the rest of the day. And usually the only time I'd go back to my office was when he was having lunch. I'd run back downstairs, order a sandwich or something from the White House mess, and grab a quick lunch, and then run back upstairs and just tag along with whatever he was doing. And, my day could end at 6:30, 7:30 at night, or it could go till after midnight, depending on what was going on.
You've worked for two iconic two-term presidents, Republican Ronald Reagan from 1983 to 1989, and Democrat Barack Obama from 2009 to 2017. Let's start with Reagan. Reagan knew a lot about the visual arts, given his long career as an actor. But what was it like to work for Reagan as one of his photographers, Pete?
He was a decent human being, very amiable, very hard to get to know, beneath the veneer that, what you see. I think maybe Nancy was the only one who ever really got to know him, what made him tick. But very friendly, and he comes from a generation before me, right? I mean, he was old-fashioned in a sense. I don't know how else to describe it. His attitude was, you never take your suit coat off in the Oval Office. And yet it was funny because on Saturdays, if he came over, if he wasn't at Camp David, which he did a lot on the weekends, but if he was in D.C., he'd usually come over to the Oval Office on Saturdays to record the radio address, which was a weekly thing he did. And he'd always, he'd be wearing like a polo shirt and jeans, or just completely casual. And it was funny that just because it was Saturday, then it was okay not, to be dressed up. And so I just thought that was kind of funny. And he had his, I said the word old-fashioned. He was also very formal in the way he approached people and the job, and I don't know how else to describe it.
Reagan was an actor, as I mentioned, and in so many ways, he played the role of president so well. Did you see a difference between the public Reagan and the private Reagan? Was it a discernible? There's a discernible difference between the two personas. The public presidential Reagan and the Reagan that you may have seen behind the scenes.
Not really. I mean, he had a very even-keeled disposition, as did President Obama, and occasionally, if he were to get angry or upset about something, you might see that behind the scenes and not as much in public. But those are rare instances. And, he could turn it on in front of a camera, in front of a TV camera, in the sense of when he was speaking, he was very disciplined about following the script, if you will, in terms of, he's told to stand here or to sit here, and any changes to his speech would be worked out beforehand, not while he was speaking, where oftentimes President Obama, just the difference, he could go off on a riff, just with nothing on the page. Whereas Reagan, I think, pretty much stuck to what he and the speechwriters had put together, and was very disciplined about the way he presented himself while he was speaking. Whereas I think behind the scenes, much more informal in the conversation than we would see publicly.
There are so many famous pictures of Reagan. Is there one that you took that you think especially well captures him? It's
always difficult to narrow it down mostly because you see the president in all the different compartments of his life, right? You see him as the commander-in-chief. You see him as the chief domestic policy person. You see him as the great speechwriter, the communicator that Reagan was. You see him on vacation on his horse. You see him interacting with his wife. You see him interacting with the staff. So it's hard to like narrow it down to one. I mean, I think he was happiest and the most comfortable when he was riding a horse. And so I have this one photograph of him. It was actually the first time I had gone to the ranch, not long after I had gotten hired in June of '83. And he was out on his ranch riding and on his white horse, El Alamein, which was a gift from the president of Mexico, I guess. And he... I think he was playing to me because he saw me set up, in the woods on the trail and just like stuck his hand out and went, "Charge!" Literally yelled that out with his finger out. And so it's kind of a tight vertical shot of him just in his happy place, I think, in many ways.
Literally riding in on a white horse.
Literally riding in on a white horse, yeah.
So 20 years to the day after leaving the Reagan White House, you begin work as chief official White House photographer for Barack Obama. Let's start with that historic day when we saw the inauguration of our first black president. What do you recall about that day, Pete?
Well, that was an amazing day. Huge crowd. On the mall. I've never seen anything like it. And had seen him in the days before working on his speech and knew this was going to be a well-honed speech, forceful, optimistic, carrying on what he said he was going to set out to do during the campaign. The excitement along the parade route, the excitement when he got out of the limousine with Michelle to walk along Pennsylvania Avenue for a part of the parade route. I remember running late. The parade went late, I think, because the luncheon went late, because the swearing-in ceremony went late, and then it all backed up. And then just the rush of going from one inaugural ball to another. I can't even remember if there were like 7 or 8 or 9 balls, kind of all over town. But I think the thing that I remember the most was that the realization that this was the one day to celebrate, and that the next day the work was going to start. Usually when I do my presentations, I show him going up to the private residence. He's loosening his tie in the elevator at sometime after 2:00 in the morning. And a little over 6 hours later, he's sitting at that desk in the Oval Office. And let's just say his expression has changed because, he now knows that, okay, we celebrated, now it's time to get to work.
I will say I was there that day. I've been to several inaugurations, and I was there for that one. And as you said, it was the biggest crowd in the history of our inaugurations, and it was so much bigger in a sense than just the inauguration of a president because of its historic nature, inaugurating the first black person to that high office. But what struck me is that he met the moment, in so many ways. Barack Obama, what we wanted from him that day, he gave us. He radiated it. And I wasn't expecting that from Obama. I knew it was going to be an historic day, but somehow he met the very auspicious moment of that day.
Well, I think the one thing that played out throughout his presidency is he did that time and time again. When it's almost as if when the nation needed him, he rose to the occasion. Whether it be his remarks at Reverend Pinckney's funeral in Charleston and saying Amazing Grace, the nation needed that. Whether it be the way he spoke to the country after the Newtown tragedy, whether it be his remarks on the passing of the Affordable Care Act. He rose to the occasion when he knew the country needed him, or we needed him, I guess, to do it. I don't know. That's what it's interesting reflecting back on. I just saw him the other day, and I was asking him how his second volume of his memoir was going, and he made some reference to, I'm writing about stuff that happened 10 years ago, which is hard in this environment, which I get. But I think it is important for him to look back and give us his view of what he was thinking. And so I'm looking forward to his second volume as much as his first.
Pete, how did working with President Obama compare to working with President Reagan?
I think the big difference was I was the chief official photographer, not one of the staff, and that his schedule was much more extensive. His work schedule was much more extensive than President Reagan's. President Reagan, this is not I'm not criticizing him, but he was kind of a 9-to-5 president, kind of. Those were his hours. Whereas for President Obama, it was just it seemed like it was every day was 10, 12 hours. And it was a different time in the country. We were facing this recession and economic situation that's really was much worse than what we're facing now, I think. I think people forget that. So I felt that as the chief photographer, I needed to be there all the time. So I was there all the time. And so it was kind of nonstop for 8 years, more so than with Reagan.
We asked you which of your photographs you thought best captures Reagan, and you mentioned the many different roles he played, but chose the one with him on the white horse. Which of your photographs do you think best captures Barack Obama, understanding that there are literally hundreds of thousands of pictures that you have taken of Barack Obama in his many roles, but is there one that you think especially captures Obama, Pete?
Well, I think there's one that maybe captures the time and what he meant, and that's the picture of young Jacob Philadelphia, the 5-year-old kid, touching his head to see if it felt like his. And, that was one of those moments. It wasn't a historic moment. It was a family was coming in. President was going to take a picture with them. This is Jacob's dad, had worked for the Foreign Service, was on the National Security Council, and was moving on to a foreign post. And during their little greet, Jacob asked him or didn't really ask him, but said that his friends had told him that his haircut was just like President Obama's. And with that, Barack Obama bent over and said, "Go ahead and touch my head." And I think that resonated with so many people, especially kids of color, right? That here's this young 5-6-year-old kid, black kid, touching the head of the President of the United States that looks like him. And imagine, what that, Jay-Z commented about it, how meant to the African-American community to see a moment like that. And so I think it's almost a symbolic photograph of his presidency. But I think, if you think about the fact that Barack Obama bent over when he said that, and said, go ahead and touch my head, that tells you something about his humanity, knowing what that little gesture meant to that little kid at the time.
Pete, no doubt there was a lot of pressure on Barack and Michelle Obama as the country's first black president and first lady. Did you see that burden weigh on them in any particular way?
I mean, I think only when I think he was more prepared for it than she was. I mean, I think there was this may have been during the campaign, an early New Yorker cover where I guess they were fist bumping or something, and it became kind of a thing. So I think that, I think for her, it might have been, more difficult. I don't know. What you didn't mention is their attempt to give the kids as much a normal life as possible while these things were playing out. I think Jenna Hager, the Bush girls, talked to the Obama girls at some point, and I think Jenna Hager told me that she told the girls, remember, to him, don't forget he's your daddy. Meaning they're going to get, your mom and dad are going to get criticized in the press a lot. That's not your dad. Your dad, your mom, which I thought was remarkable advice, right? And think about, like, if you go back, look, this is a guy who, even while he was president, there was, conspiracy theories that he was not a U.S. citizen and thus was not a legitimate president. That's the time we live in. So he's having to deal with that kind of stuff, including, let's face it, there's still a lot of racism in our country, and there were a lot of people that were not happy that we elected a black guy to president. Yeah. And that played out a lot on social media. But I'd say for the most part, he understood that was going to happen, and and was able to deal with it sometimes with humor, I guess.
You were in the White House for a collective 14 years. When you look back on it, what was your most memorable day as a White House photographer?
I'm laughing because it's kind of like asking me, what's my favorite photo, which, I never answer that question, and I kind of did it for you. I don't know if I said favorite, but I actually narrowed it down to, one picture for Reagan and one for Obama, which I never do, but under these circumstances, just the way you phrased it, I thought I could do it. So this is kind of the same thing. It's hard to do. There's so many memorable days. Of course, I got married at the White House. I wasn't the photographer for my own wedding, so maybe that presupposes giving that as an answer. There was. I think in some ways it was the day that the House voted to pass the Affordable Care Act, because I had seen in the previous months how hard he and the staff had worked to make this happen against all odds, right? So many presidents since, I think, Teddy Roosevelt had tried to pass some kind of health insurance like this. always failed. And he did this while at the same time trying to save the economy, right? I mean, that's kind of when 2009 was when, they kind of started the process for getting the Affordable Care Act passed the following year. And there was a sense of inner joy with him that night that you didn't see that much, because like Reagan, very even-keeled disposition. He was not one to, jump up and down when things went really well or get too down when things went really bad. But I could tell, I could sense that joy in him that night. And at one point, he said to me that he was happier on that day than he was the day that he was elected.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because you do all this, meaning run for president and go through the 2-year slog of a campaign in the hopes that you get to a point where you can get some stuff done that really helps, the American people. And he thought this was going to really help a lot of people. And I could see that in him. I could see that almost inner joy that night. So, because of that, it was a favorite day for me, because I saw him, sort of almost surpass his happiness at getting elected.
Well, my next question was going to be the one that you dread most about, your favorite or most historically meaningful photo. But let me come at that from a different angle and see if I can make it more interesting or more answerable. I would imagine that in your role as White House photographer, there are times when you see your work used by other people, because after all, the photos that you produce, are available to the public in most cases, I would imagine. Have you ever been really surprised or taken aback to see an image that you took, used in a way that you hadn't imagined?
Oh, that happened all the time, and for good reasons and bad reasons. I mean, we talk about the Jacob Philadelphia photograph. I have to admit, I didn't realize how important that photograph was, because it was just what I call a little moment, not on a historic day, no big event, and yet it resonated with so many people that I just didn't even realize it at first. So that's one. There was another one when President Obama created some controversy when he gave a long-form interview to a magazine. I don't remember if it was The Atlantic or what it was, when he was getting hammered about, people were saying that Obama was going to take away their Second Amendment. And he was all fired up about it. And then in The Atlantic, he said something along the lines of that he understands why, people like to hunt and target shoot. And he said that he himself did skeet shooting at Camp David. And nobody believed him, right? So it became a thing, like cable TV. And so that really pissed him off that nobody believed him. Well, what I knew is that he did shoot skeet at Camp David because I shot skeet with him a couple of times. And I had photographs of this. And so there was this big debate within the administration on whether to release one of these photographs. And so I got a bunch of photos together, so they could decide, and I gave my preference on which one we should release, and we made it public to sort of try to knock down the conspiracy theories that he was lying. And we made this public, and it turned into an investigation on whether this was a real photograph or it had been made, with a green screen on the South Lawn, not at Camp David, and how the press had his schedule that day, and how there was no way he could be playing golf with his Hawaii friends at Andrews Air Force Base at 3:00 in the afternoon and be skeet shooting at Camp David at 5:00, when in fact that's exactly what happened. And so that was like one of those times when a photograph like goes awry for the wrong, like just because that's the place we live in now. You weren't expecting that kind of an answer, I know.
Right. That's fabulous.
But I was actually thinking about that today, because it's there were times when we tried to think, because we did make a lot of photographs public during the administration, but you had to like just pause for a second and say, is this somehow going to cause some like stupid conspiracy theory if we make this photograph public? Just because of the nature of where we live. I mean, look what happened with, this didn't involve a photograph, but with the whole Paul Pelosi tragedy, and it's just become like people just make stuff up. So,
well, let me go from hunting, which you mentioned a moment ago, to fishing. All fishermen talk about the one that got away. Are there moments that you witnessed, Pete, that you didn't capture, that you wished you had gotten photographs of, that you had captured the moment through your lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did pretty good, actually. I think there were instances when we were in another country, and there might be things going on that I wouldn't get access to because of the foreign government. And I was speaking specifically of Russia, where we had this big I think it was a G20 summit in St. Petersburg. And, the Russians just basically stuck me with the press. And when Obama and Putin had what we call a pull-aside inside the castle, when they were going to be discussing some really serious stuff that they just wouldn't let me in for. So, I mean, there were probably other instances where that happened just because of, other foreign governments trying to keep me out of the room. I mean, I don't think it was directed at me personally, just directed at, the White House photographer is not going to, be in the room to make this picture.
Pete, you've been a best-selling author now multiple times. One of your books is called Shade, and it contrasts the Obama administration with the Trump administration. You were there in the White House in its waning days after President Trump had won the 2016 election, and clearly it weighed heavily on the president and his staff. What were you feeling on election night and in the days thereafter leading up to the inauguration of our 45th president, Donald Trump?
Election night, I had gone home to have dinner with my wife, and the plan was I was going to go back to the White House. The president was not in the West Wing. He was up in the private residence. But I said that I should be there when he calls Hillary to congratulate her. That's what we all thought, right? And so I watched the beginning of the results on TV, and then I got a message, I think, from Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff. And he said, everybody was watching what was going on, and he was like, president's not going to call anybody tonight. He's going to wait till the morning. And so I ended up going to bed before the results were announced because I could see that it was a lost cause. I forget what state they called, and I was like, there's no way that Hillary's going to pull this out, and I just can't stand to watch the rest on TV. So I went to bed, I got up, and had like 1 million texts from friends and stuff like that. Like, what happened? And I remember being, I am of the age where I was in 4th grade when Kennedy was assassinated. Was obviously alive during the 1968, terrible year that was for so many reasons. Watergate, 9/11. So my attitude walking to the White House or driving to the White House that day was, shit happened and we've survived worse, is what I was thinking. But I was really, obviously down about it. And I walked into the West Wing, and my office was right across from the chief speechwriter's office. And Cody Keenan, the chief speechwriter, wasn't in yet, but his young assistant was sitting at her desk. And, she had become a friend of mine. So I stuck my head in and said, "How you doing, Susanna?" And she just started crying. And she, was 22 or 3 and had not experienced the things that I had experienced in our history. And I was somewhat taken aback that, so this is how this day is going to go, And I think that President Obama, when he came to the Oval that day, I think he was probably thinking along the lines that I was thinking, that we had seen a lot. And, he always talked about the arc. It changes, it goes up, it goes down, but it bends towards justice most of the time, right? And so he ended up spending much of that day trying to be the cheerleader for the staff and trying to let them know that their work still mattered, what they accomplished. And also thought that it was important for him to get Trump in there right away because he had a good read on how the country was reacting to this. And, he believed in peaceful transfer of power and the way the Bushes had treated him. And he, usually the incoming president doesn't come for a week or two or even longer. He got Trump in there 2 days later because he thought it was important for the country to see the makings of this transfer of power.
Pete, so you left the White House in 2017, and presumably a new team of photographers came in with President Trump. What's your sense of how the photography operation worked during the Trump presidency?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Shayla Craighead, who was my successor, didn't get hired until like a couple of days before the inauguration. So I only had a chance to talk to her on the phone for like an hour. And then, of course, I saw it on her inauguration day. And that's really the last I've heard from her. So I don't know. I mean, we see the kind of photographs that were made public, and they were mostly public-facing photos, not really behind the scenes. So I don't know. I don't know what took place there.
So, Pete, I'm just putting this together now. We mentioned the fact that lightning had struck twice for you, having been in the Reagan White House and then the Obama White House as an official White House photographer. But it occurs to me that you were not only capturing the 40th and 44th presidents, you were also capturing in those White Houses the future 41st president and the future 46th president. You were in the White House with Vice President George H.W. Bush and Vice President Joe Biden. I wonder, when you look back at your time with Biden, what are your reflections on our current president?
The man that I saw during the 8 years of the Obama administration was, I think, one of the most compassionate human beings I've ever met. One of the most decent human beings I've ever met. This is Joe Biden I'm talking about. And I think we've seen that play out. I mean, I remember saying to some friends of mine that I think we didn't see the real Biden the first year and a half because he was always wearing a mask out of necessity, and so it's hard to interact with people in a compassionate and empathetic way when you're wearing a mask. And I think now that the masks are mostly off, you see that compassion and that empathy with him. So I look, he's not the most eloquent speaker, but if you look at what he's gotten done, he's gotten a lot of stuff done that is pretty remarkable. I finally, I went to the White House for the first time since leaving for the Obama's portrait unveiling at the White House, and I didn't get to talk to Biden that much. But one of the things I said to him was that when he was vice president, he would always be calling his grandkids, like all the time, like every day he had to call each of the grandkids. And I just thought that was kind of odd. I now have a granddaughter, and I get it, so that's the one thing I said to him. I said, Mr. President, I said, never really understood why you always felt you had to call your grandkids. I said, now I understand. I get it now. It's like if a day goes by where I don't get a chance to FaceTime her, I feel like something's missing from my day. So, but the other thing, Mark, I'll say is not only that, but I also got to see the 41st and 45th president, at least for one day while they were president, and watched, even though that was brief, you still got a good sense of what they're like behind the scenes. So I did get a chance.
In a propitious moment on Inauguration Day, on the first day of their presidencies.
Right. And obviously with 40 to 41, it was, very much a cordial interaction, whereas not that the 44 to 45 wasn't cordial, but there was a lot of stuff, going on, if you know what I mean. And some of their interactions were really quite interesting, I thought.
Well, Pete Souza, what a pleasure it is to have this chance to talk to you about your long and illustrious career taking pictures of American presidents, among many other subjects. Congratulations on your new book, West Wing and Beyond, What I Saw Inside the Presidency. Thank you so much for making time to be with us.
Thanks for having me on, Mark and Mark.
My thanks to our sponsors, the Moody Foundation and St. David's Healthcare, and as always, to you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Mark Updegrove. See you next time.